Okay, so this is going to be our nervous system lecture. We're going to start here by talking about kind of just the general functions of the nervous system. Before we even start, you can think to yourself and think about um, what parts of the nervous system you may already be familiar with, at least a little bit. Some things maybe more than others. Um, think about some of the functions. Think about some of the different parts of the nervous system. Um, and then we have different divisions of the nervous system. So we have kind of um, this hierarchy and these kind of categories that all fall within our nervous system. So we will get started here. We'll talk about some different functions of the nervous system. So we have things like integration, voluntary effects, um, modification of involuntary effects, reflexes, sensory information. And so with integration, we'll start with integration. The nervous system links different parts of our body together. It links together different other anatomical systems. So you can think of things like the muscular system and skeletal system, endocrine system. They're all connected in some way or another via the nervous system. Okay, so if you take muscles and bones, for example, we have our muscles attached to bone. Our muscle is going to be innervated by a nerve, which is part of the nervous system. When that muscle becomes innervated, it will act on the bone, and then it will cause movement. Whenever the muscle contracts, it pulls on the bone, and you get gross body movement. But without the nervous system, that's not going to happen. Okay, so the nervous system can integrate and put these different things together so they actually are able to function properly. When we get to the endocrine system, you see that the nervous system can have some effects on that. We'll compare and contrast the nervous system and endocrine system a little bit. And some different structures that we associate with the nervous system can sometimes be associated with the endocrine system as well. We have control of voluntary effectors, so things like our skeletal muscle. We know that our skeletal muscle is a voluntary type of muscle tissue. And again, like we just said, by innervating that skeletal muscle, we can cause contraction and movement. Now, involuntary effectors. So, still, we'll stick with muscle tissue here, but we'll talk about the different types of muscle tissue. So, cardiac and smooth. Cardiac and smooth muscle tissue um, are both involuntary types of muscle, and so what that means is that they're going to um, act on their own and do not require our conscious input to control them, but they can still be modified by our nervous system. So things like heart rate. If you further stimulate the heart, you can increase the heart rate. When we talk about the autonomic nervous system, um, you have two types. You have sympathetic and parasympathetic. By influencing the heart with either sympathetic or parasympathetic, you can affect the rate at which it will contract. And you can do the same thing for smooth muscle. If you um, increase parasympathetic innervation to smooth muscle, say in the digestive tract, you'll get increased contraction of the smooth muscle, so things like peristalsis. And then we also have glands. So different glands in our body um, are innervated and thus are able to function properly via the input of nerves. Reflexes is another one. So things like our patellar tendon reflexes. We have little things called Golgi tendon organs within our organs that, and also things called muscle spindles. That when these things contract and when they are stimulated, they can produce an action that results in a very quick reflex. We respond to sensory stimuli via our nervous system. So our eyes are part of our nervous system. Um, our sense of smell, taste, hearing, all of these different things um, are individual responses to different types of sensory stimuli. And then other things like perception, personality, how we respond, our emotions, things like this, fear, anger. These are all things that you can categorize as being directed by the nervous system. So when we divide our nervous system, we can divide it into a couple of different parts. Okay, the two broad parts. So if you can imagine this, if you draw it out, Up at the very top of a piece of paper, if you just wrote nervous system, underneath that nervous system, you could draw two arrows, and you could write central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Okay. From this, we can continue out even further, and we can have a sensory and a motor component to these. Sensory is sometimes called afferent, and motor is sometimes called efferent. What the sensory nervous system is this is receiving stimuli in the periphery and bringing it to the central nervous system. So I like to remember sensory, it's bringing things to the nervous system, so it's arriving, and then afferent starts with an A as well. Okay, so sensory or afferent is bringing it to the nervous system. Motor is taking things from the central nervous system and going out to different effector tissues. So if sensory is arriving at the central nervous system, motor is exiting the central nervous system. So E and efferent, E exiting, we're traveling away from or out of the central nervous system to get to some other effector tissue. Okay, so we have motor neurons that leave our spinal cord and go out to muscles and stimulate those muscles. We then have sensory receptors. We have different types of sensory receptors, so maybe one like a thermoreceptor that detects changes in temperature and heat, may detect this change, this stimulus, and send it to the central nervous system, where we're then able to receive that and perceive that as some change in temperature. Okay, so here we can see central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Our central nervous system will include the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system will include everything else. So all of these peripheral spinal nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system. Okay. Here we can see the same thing. So we have brain. Brain is part of what? Part of central nervous system. Spinal cord here, central nervous system. And then here you can see this is a magnetic resonance imaging, so an MRI of the brain. So this is a looks like a mid-sagittal section through the brain, and you can see different parts. We can see cerebrum. We can see this right here. This is the corpus callosum. We'll look at the pons, the medulla, cerebellum here, and so this is again still part of our central nervous system. And here you can see the very cephalic portion or cranial portion of the spinal cord here. This is the brain stem, and the brain stem continues inferiorly through the foramen magnum to become the spinal cord going out. But again, still spinal cord is still part of the central nervous system. So here we can see our peripheral nervous system. So spinal cord is part of central, and then these nerves coming off either side are part of our peripheral nervous system. So we'll have peripheral nerves here. We'll also see and talk about cranial nerves. We have 12 pairs of cranial nerves that originate up in the skull, off the brain and brainstem, and exert their functions either up in the head and neck region, and some actually extend down and exert their actions in the thorax and the abdominal regions as well. So if we're looking and classifying our nerves based on their direction that they carry information, we can see our afferent or sensory. Remember again, this is arriving to the spinal cord, arriving to the central nervous system, to our spinal cord, and our motor neuron or our efferent neuron is leaving or exiting the central nervous system to go out to some effector tissue. So in this instance, we're going to a muscle. Our afferent or sensory neuron was coming from skin, so maybe detecting pressure. Sometimes maybe it's a mechanoreceptor. Maybe it was detecting pain. Maybe it was detecting a change in temperature. Whatever it is, it's bringing that information to the central nervous system. So if we continue dividing our nervous system into different parts, we also can have a somatic and autonomic. And we've already mentioned these, but we haven't given a name to them, so we'll do that now. Somatic is going to be things that we can voluntarily and consciously control. So you can think about something, and you can make the decision to cause that thing to contract, cause a muscle to contract. You can control when you speak, things like this. And the opposite of this is going to be our autonomic nervous system. So autonomic means it is under it is automatically controlled by our body. We do not have conscious, voluntary control over this. And so these are things like um, sweating, there's things like our heart contracting, smooth muscle in our digestive tract and blood vessels, the stimulation of different glands in our body. These are all under autonomic control. And you can take that autonomic division of the nervous system and divide it even further into sympathetic and parasympathetic. We briefly talked about that. Sympathetic is sometimes generally referred to as your fight or flight, and then parasympathetic referred to generally as your rest and digest. And for the most part, many things fit into this dichotomy of sympathetic being fight or flight and parasympathetic being rest and digest. But some things don't. It's not a perfect distinction, a perfect division between these two. Everything that's sympathetic is fight or flight, and everything that is parasympathetic is rest and digest. But it's a really good place to start and a good way to begin organizing your thoughts when talking about this. So here you can see things under autonomic control, so things like skeletal muscle. Here we can see a motor neuron coming out, lower motor neurons going out to our skeletal muscle. And if we come over here to the right, here we see things like cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and our glands that we discussed. Adipocytes are fat cells. And again, these are controlled by autonomic nervous system here, right? And so we'll talk about in a later lecture for sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons. These have a very specific structure and layout to them. We'll see different links in nerves, and it will be a two neuron pathway for our autonomic nervous system. So again, somatic, things that we can control. So this is representing skeletal muscle. Autonomic, things like our heart. This blue line here, this is representing our vagus nerve, which is our 10th cranial nerve. And this is a very important parasympathetic nerve, and it actually comes down from the within the skull, off the brainstem, comes down in through the neck, down into the thoracic cavity to get the heart, and it actually continues down here, as you see this blue line representing, down into the abdominal cavity to actually provide parasympathetic innervation to parts of our digestive tract. And again, parasympathetic nerves here, or parasympathetic effects, and then sympathetic effects here. So if you think about it in the distinction of sympathetic is fight or flight, parasympathetic is rest and digest, a lot of these make sense. If you are in a fight or flight response, this is your sympathetic response. Imagine something dangerous is happening. You're being, chased by, a wild animal or something like that. Most of these things make sense. Your pupils are going to dilate to make your pupils larger so you can gather more light so you're able to see better. You're going to increase your heart rate because you need to be pumping more blood. You're going to relax and open up your airways in order to breathe and bring in more air. You're going to inhibit stomach activity, gallbladder, inhibit activity of intestines, because at this point we're not overly concerned about digesting any food that we may have in our stomach. We're more concerned about bringing in enough air, oxygen, and pumping and circulating a sufficient amount of blood to different muscles and different regions of our body. And then when you go over to parasympathetic, it's going to be exactly the opposite. Parasympathetic, you just finished a big meal, you're relaxing, you're not in any type of stress or there's no worry. And so your pupils are going to constrict, right? You may stimulate some saliva production, maybe for digestion in your mouth, maybe. Your heart rate's going to slow down. Your airways, they don't need to be as dilated because we're not as concerned about bringing in large volumes of air. And we're going to stimulate our digestive tract, right? So our stomach, large intestine, small intestine, liver, gallbladder, to begin digesting and breaking down different things that we just ate. Okay, so if you kind of think about it in that sense, most things from parasympathetic you can put under the category of rest digest, and most things under sympathetic you can put under fight or flight. All right. So we will stop there for part one, and we'll pick up with part two, talking about the histology of nervous tissue.